Democrat of Vermont, and a chief deputy whip, the chief deputy whip on the House side. Mr. Welch, can you tell us, first off, why you voted against the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act yesterday in the House of Representatives?
Well, it was very extreme. Number one, it would require a supermajority if you were going to try to get rid of any tax loophole. That's just number one. So, for instance, let's say you wanted to get rid of the preference, you want to get rid of the ethanol tax credit, $6 billion that we're spending, and put that into deficit reduction. You would have to get 2/3 plus 1 in order to do it. So what you were doing is putting Congress in handcuffs so that it actually couldn't make decisions. You'd put in the Constitution these protected categories of tax breaks, special interest tax breaks. So it really doesn't, in my view, make a lot of sense. I think what we need is a balanced approach to dealing with the deficit, not a balanced budget amendment, particularly one that has these constraints that prohibit Congress from actually getting rid of some of these tax loopholes that are really a big problem in the tax code.
So when you say a balanced approach, what does that include?
Well, we've got, what it includes is revenues. Those are off the table with the Republican plan right now. And that includes revenues where we clean up the tax code and get rid of some of these things like the ethanol tax credit or the big oil deductions that Mr. Goodlatte was talking about. It includes cuts in programs, and the Democrats have to be willing to work with Republicans in that. It has to include the Pentagon. I mean, the Pentagon budget is over $700 billion. It has to include a pay-as-you-go approach to budgeting. For instance, the Iraq War is over $1 trillion, and that has never been paid for. And we just wave away fiscal responsibility by not taking on the burden of paying for the things that we approve. So I've been a strong supporter of pay-as-you-go, so that if we're proposing to spend money, we have to either cut in one place in order to find the money, or we have to raise the revenue. And then you link the responsibility for paying for the program or the war or whatever it is with the actual expenditure. The pay-as-you-go approach actually does make a lot of sense, much more so in many ways than a balanced budget amendment, where you're constrained from doing things in an emergency, an economic downturn, situations where the federal government actually has to step up and provide some boost for the economy.
Well, Congressman Welch, the Republicans, is it fair to say, have pretty much drawn a line in the sand when it comes to increasing taxes?
They have.
And so how do you get from there to where you are to August 2nd and raising the debt ceiling and cutting spending?
Well, it's very precarious. I mean, I've actually been an advocate of a clean increase in the debt ceiling. This debt ceiling politics is actually quite dangerous for the economy and for America. You know, there are a lot of components of that deficit that is, by the way, absolutely a serious problem. But there are elements in there that are expenditures for things that I was strongly opposed to. The Iraq War, for instance, $1 trillion. Afghanistan, we haven't paid for that. The tax cuts during the Bush years that added to the deficit. I was against all of those. But those are obligations that have been incurred. So whether I was part of the Congress that approved them or didn't, we pay our bills. So my point on the debt is that obligations that have already been incurred, we have to pay. And in fact, Ronald Reagan, no stranger to budget battles and tax fights, iconic figure for the Republicans, revered by many Democrats, absolutely kept debt ceiling politics off the table because he knew that it was like the neutron bomb. If we defaulted on our credit rating, we lost our AAA credit rating, that would do enormous damage to the American economy. And whether you have the Nancy Pelosi view of the world or the Eric Cantor view of the world, if we default and interest rates go up 1%, that is going to be $140 billion additional debt service. That is not good for anybody, Pelosi or Cantor. So we pay our bills. Now, the dilemma, and we're going to do it, by the way. The question is whether we'll do it before the bond markets whip us into doing that which we know must be done. And then if we do it too late and too reluctantly, we could do a lot of damage to the economy.
Two other proposals I want to ask you about before we go to calls. First of all, the Gang of Six debt plan. The proposal: reduce the deficit $4 trillion over 10 years, overhaul the tax code $1 trillion, immediate spending cuts, $500 billion, and put future spending caps on Medicare, Social Security, and farm subsidies. Those are some of the highlights of the Gang of Six plan. From what you've read about it and seen about it and talked about, what's your view of that plan?
Well, at the 30,000-foot level, what is good about the Gang of Six plan is, one, it's bipartisan, two, it includes revenues, three, it's comprehensive, and four, it puts a significant dent in the deficit. If you're talking $3.7 to $4 trillion over 10 years, and that's in an economy that will generate something in the order of $150 trillion, that's significant. That's a significant dent in the deficit. So on all of those, for those four reasons, there's a lot of promise to the outline and parameters of the Gang of Six approach. Now, all of us in Congress, except the Gang of Six, are looking at the details and kicking the tires. So it's very, very difficult to be to say how it is specifically when we don't know what the specifics are. But it's a much more promising approach than the showdown that we're having in the House right now.
Mitch McConnell's approach to the debt ceiling dilemma.
Well, just for your viewers, the Mitch McConnell approach is basically a clean debt ceiling with deniability. I mean, what, as I understand it, he's proposing, pardon me, is for the senators essentially to abdicate their responsibility. They won't vote yes or no on the debt ceiling increase, but they'll delegate to the president so that he can raise the debt ceiling and avoid default, pay our bills. So the good news is that America would pay its bills, it wouldn't default. The bad news is that Congress would add to the public disrepute of the way we do business. I mean, why is it that if you're elected to be a United States Senator, you don't have to vote in the light of day, yes or no, on increasing the debt ceiling? And that's what the McConnell plan would allow the senators to do. Delegate the authority to the president to do that which they say they don't want him to do, and then reserve the right to criticize. It's a pretty convoluted way of proceeding.
Could you see yourself supporting it?
Well, if it's that or default, the answer is yes. We have to avoid default. Also, my position is very clear. I actually have voted myself for a clean extension of the debt ceiling, much like we did during the Reagan years.
Peter Welch is our guest, Democrat of Vermont. He represents the entire state of Vermont. He is a chief deputy whip on the Democratic side. He is a graduate of Holy Cross College and the University of California, Berkeley. Did you get your law degree out at UCal?
I did, yeah.
Okay. And our first call for him comes from San Clemente, California. Gene on a Republican line. Hi, Gene.
Morning. I ran through some calculations the other day, and I looked at my contributions to Medicare. It looks like I'll have paid about $40,000 over my working life, and as I understand it, I'm going to get about $300,000 in benefits. Now, that's great. Now, how are you going to protect that? Are you going to raise all the tax rates above a certain level to 100%?
No. You do have a good deal. I mean, Medicare is, number one, an incredibly important health care program for you and for all Americans once they reach age 65. The challenge we have in Medicare is the challenge we have in health care. I mean, the cost of health care in the country is going up 2 and 3 times the rate of inflation, the rate of wages, the rate of profits. And obviously that's not sustainable, whether it's in the Medicare program or in the private health care program. So a major challenge that we have in this country, in businesses, in states, and in the federal government, is to try to restrain this escalation in health care costs that is outstripping our ability to pay.
Boring file clerk tweets in, Congressman Welch, why is default such a bad thing? Who are we to be held hostage to non-U.S. entities?
Well, we owe the money. If you borrow money, you've got to pay it back. It's as simple as that. You know, if you borrow money for your mortgage and you don't make your mortgage payment, bad things are going to happen to your credit rating. If you owe money on your car and you don't pay it, you may get your car repossessed. So there's a moral obligation if you borrow the money to do something, then you owe it. For me, it's as simple as that. The other thing is that if we default as a country and our credit rating goes down, our interest rates that we have to pay go up, not just as taxpayers on the debt service, but that ripples throughout the economy. So if you're borrowing money for a house or a car or on your credit card, your interest rates are going to go up. Also, we default, that's going to smack the markets very, very hard. So folks with So folks with savings in their retirement plans, putting money aside so their kids can go to college, those things would take a very significant hit. So I think it's really reckless and irresponsible for anybody to entertain the notion that we won't pay our bills.
Jim Hines tweets in, please vote no on the McConnell plan. It's a slippery slope. Democrats won't always have the executive. Next call for Congressman Welch comes from Huntsville, Alabama. Hi, June, Democrat.
Hello, thank you. I am a Democrat, and I have not just voted Democrat all the time. As a person of color, I thought it was important once voter rights were gained that we research everyone, and I go with the person that has the best plan. My question is, I watched C-SPAN's hearing with the Senate on with Bernanke, and just was amazed at the Republican response, which was, to me, very outstanding, very open to listening to what was going on. I guess my question is a two-part question, because I wonder if the Gang of Six then met after that and developed their bill. But the second part of what I wanted to know is that I wanted to, well, not know, but tell people and encourage them to start researching the information you hear, because the media news is not always accurate. I respect C-SPAN for being accurate and not changing the process of what we're going with. But I encourage all callers, because I hear people calling that seem to know absolutely nothing but what they're hearing on the news. And I encourage them to start researching it, and I encourage C-SPAN to please rerun that hearing with the Bernanke, because it cleared up so much for me.
All right, June, thank you for that call. And by the way, of course, you can go to cspan.org to our video library, and you can watch any hearing at any time that we have covered. So that is available online if that's an option for you. Jim, on our independent line, Royal Oak, Michigan, you're on the air. Please go ahead.
Thank you for taking my call. Now, my problem is everybody keeps talking about deficit, but you have 20 million people either unemployed or underemployed. So you have a great need for government spending, but at the same time you have a drain on revenues. So for all these, I just hate when the Republicans keep saying we have a spending problem, not a revenue problem. And the previous caller that called in, about 40,000, getting 300,000. But I've been paying into Social Security since the 40s. I'm now 81 years old. So I've been paying, not in today's dollars. In 1955, if you made $5,000 a year, you were considered middle class. You could buy a car, you could buy a house. Now today, if you made $5,000 a year, you'd be walking the streets. So, and I'm sick and tired of them calling them entitlements.
Congressman Welch.
Well, you have a very good point. I mean, the biggest challenge we have in this country is getting the economy moving and getting people back to work. I mean, 9.2% unemployment, and millions of people who are working are only working part-time, and they need full-time work. And wages have been stagnant. I mean, you are absolutely right. And the bottom line here is that we have to do two things at once, ideally. One is that we would find places we could invest to make education better and more accessible, to rebuild our infrastructure. I mean, the roads, the bridges, the necessity to have broadband deployed throughout this country. The water and sewer systems in our cities and towns across the country are in need of great repair. Our ports and airports, all of these things are becoming second-rate compared to many of our competitor countries. If we rebuild that, that is infrastructure that serves not just you and me, but generations that follow us. So that's an area where we have to invest. Other things, we've really got to make reforms to try to limit the spending, like the Pentagon. Like, for instance, healthcare expenses. If we find a better way to deliver healthcare where we're not just rewarding volume with the fee-for-service system that is so expensive and oftentimes inefficient, we can save money in areas where we do need to save money. So we have to do both here, and that's what I was talking about earlier when we have a balanced approach. Even in tough times, when businesses are looking at the bottom line, every line item that they have in their budget, they look at carefully. They also have to spend money and invest so that they're there to fight another day, and our government is somewhat the same.
Carl Allen of Hobbs, New Mexico emails in, Democrats use this word revenue. I think the word they are looking for is taxes. My friends, do not be misled or rose by any other name. Next call for Congressman Welch comes from David in Coldwater, Michigan, Republican line. Hi, David.
Hello. Good morning. Good morning, Congressman Welch.
Good morning.
My question is alluded to the expensive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, yeah, deploying troops is very expensive. So why don't we fight these as nuclear wars? They'd be over within a few minutes, and the cost of a few nuclear weapons would wipe these countries off the map and wouldn't cost us hardly anything at all.
Well, I can't agree with you on that.
This tweet comes from Matt Smith. Recently, Vermont instituted single-payer health care. Can we ask our guest for the basics of the program and his thoughts?
Well, Vermont does not have single payer. It is committed to getting to single payer. So what the legislature did is establish a commission. The governor is appointing a number of people to serve on it to try to resolve the practical challenges of going from the multi-payer system that we now have to a single-payer system. And one of the challenges that we have, any state would have, is that we need the cooperation of the federal government to give Vermont waiver authority so that it can implement a single-payer plan. So it is not established yet, but a commitment has been made by the legislature and the governor. And interestingly enough, this was a major issue in the gubernatorial campaign. And our governor, who ran and won, ran explicitly on the pledge of doing everything he could to implement single payer. So Vermont voters voted for that.
Fairfax, Virginia. George on our Democrats line. We're talking with Congressman Peter Welch, Democrat of Vermont, about some of the debt ceiling and budgetary issues in Washington today.
It seems like one of the problems it comes from something as far back as the antitrust regulation when ExxonMobil were broken up. I'm a little confused. I have two comments. But if they were broken up under antitrust regulation, what changed? And if nothing changed, what are you doing to break them back up again? And the second comment is the Democrats will never be able to get their message out while the fairness doctrine is not reinstated. Let me just expand on that. Hitler used the Republican kind of free speech to motivate the German public before the Second World War, and that was called propaganda. Fox News is not allowed to broadcast in Canada because they lied too much. What are you doing about reinstating the fairness doctrine? You had all three branches of government, and you did nothing about this. You must have some foresight. Please do something.
Well, you had two things. One is about the antitrust breakup of the oil companies. I'm not familiar with the history of that, but as I recall, that goes back really to the turn of last century. And the oil companies are big, and it would be up to the antitrust. And I heard anyone talking about how antitrust could be used to address our situation with the oil companies. I mean, the big challenge we have in energy, in my view, is to try to start moving to a post-carbon energy economy. Obviously, you can't just turn the lights off, and carbon fuels continue to be and will continue to be part of the mix. But if we sit on our hands and don't start investing in alternatives, then we're going to not only continue to have an explosion of greenhouse gases, but we're going to fall behind economically in the job-creating potential that comes from wind and solar, from electric vehicles, from things that China is starting to do faster than us. Now, secondly, you got a point about the media. It's, I think, a loss to the public debate that we don't have stronger newspapers, that we have all these media outlets, but we have less news. I mean, C-SPAN is an example of unfiltered opportunity to hear and watch directly. And that earlier citizen who called and said people should research, something like C-SPAN gives you the opportunity to watch as things are happening and come to your own conclusion, rather than the filtered news that oftentimes we watch on many different stations.
In your viewing of the British phone hacking scandal, what is the impact, do you think, and do you think Congress should be investigating?
Well, there's two things. Number one, it's a very vivid example of the loss of credibility of major news organizations in Britain. Obviously, that whole hacking scandal was about newspapers not so much getting news as peddling sensationalism and crossing ethical and legal boundaries in order to be the first to get a so-called scoop, which was usually something that was embarrassing to the object of hacking. Secondly, if there is hacking that has been done by those organizations, for instance, some question as to whether the victims of 9/11 had been subject to hacking, then that could be a criminal problem and should be investigated and should be prosecuted.
Next call for Congressman Welch comes from Round Rock, Texas. Hi, Amin.
Good morning. First of all, I want to say that I am a Reagan Republican, and this Republican Party that's out today, I was offended when that guy compared himself with me. They're nothing like Reagan. Reagan negotiated.
Right.
Reagan didn't turn down everything the Democrats had. These Republicans, they refuse to do anything that the president's, if the president's for it, they're against it. And if they think that the American people are going to let them get reelected next time on making the backs of the poor, the helpless, the homeless, the ones that they're going to tax and keep taking stuff away from, they haven't seen they won't see another turnout like they since the last one they saw when Obama ran, because people are fed up with letting the people that have keep having and taking away from the people that don't have. One thing I like to say is, when are we going to do something about term limitations? I mean, the president can only be president for 8 years. Why does the Senate and the House have to be president for 40 and 20 years? If we had 8-year terms for the Senate and the House, I believe a lot of the problems we have right now would be solved.
Well, two things. Number one, I really like what you said about President Reagan. He did negotiate. You know, the last time we had a major reform in Social Security was when we had President Reagan reach an agreement with Tip O'Neill, who was a quintessential Democratic urban politician. And the two of them got together. The goal was to make Social Security solvent and sustainable. And they came up with adjustments in Social Security to protect it. Not to rate it, but to protect it. You know, that was a Republican and a Democrat. Also, President Reagan, as you mentioned, he came in to lower taxes, and he did. It was like a 25% across the board decrease in income tax rates. But then when the deficit started exploding, he actually raised taxes. He was willing to look at the reality of the situation and try to figure out where to cut and where to raise revenue. And what we do have in Washington, as you mentioned, right now is on the Republican side, it's doctrine that we won't do anything on revenues, even if the revenues are by getting rid of these wasteful loopholes. Now, term limitations, I disagree with you, because I think that, number one, if you look at Congress, the voters have sent messages in the last 3 elections. You know, in '06, when I was elected, there was a large Democratic victory in the House. Many seats changed hands, and the Democrats became the majority. And then in the last election, it was the opposite. There was a huge voter turnout, and a big Republican majority was elected. So without term limits, you did have voters sending their message to Washington, particularly as reflected in the House of Representatives. So I think the voters have the final say, and that's the way it should be.
Congressman Welch, as he said, was elected first in 2006 and now is in his 3rd term. In the House, you have about nearly 90 Republican freshmen who essentially have said, drawn the line in the sand, said no new taxes. They're in a political position there. How, again, do you operate, get to August 2nd and raise the debt ceiling?
Well, bottom line, this is something that is a challenge for Mr. Boehner. He's our Speaker. and he's a seasoned politician. He's a good man. But he's got a challenge, because what you've seen with the Democrats on the debt ceiling, I mean, we've got our disagreements on many issues, but a majority of us voted for a clean extension, not because we're unwilling to do things towards a budget deal. We want to do that, but we don't want to hold hostage the full faith and credit of the United States. And Mr. Boehner has to get some votes on his side. And bottom line, I think he clearly understands, and the leadership understands, that we can't stiff our creditors. So how he's going to manage to get his folks to do what needs to be done, I'm not sure he even has the answer yet. I mean, the sensible thing here is what I think most Americans want. We'd give a little, they'd give a little. We'd take some, we'd get some in revenues, we'd get some in cuts, and we'd put the two together and we'd move ahead. By the way, one of the big challenges for Congress is to find a way to start working together. You know, this total partisan approach, whether it's on health care or on the budget, is the kind of gridlock that the rating agencies are citing as an indication and a reason why they might downgrade our credit rating. You know, a great country has to have an institution that can make decisions that need to be made in a timely way. And generally, those are better if we can do them together.
Elaine is in North Smithfield, Rhode Island. Independent line, you're on with Congressman Peter Welch.
Yes, good morning. I have a couple of comments before I ask my real question. For the Republican Party, when they're out and on talking, even on your show, how they act like bullies, and trying to keep our children from becoming bullies. And if they watch any of these things on TV and see how the Republicans are always bullying the Democratic Party and putting all the blame on them, it has to stop. And this other man who says that his main job in the Republican Party is to get rid of that man so he only has a one-term presidency. Now, if it was someone walking down the street, they would be arrested for threatening the life of the President of the United States. Now, my main question that I would like to ask is, on the, I understand federal and state employees get 3% COLAs increases every year. I'm retired. I was on disability.
Mm-hmm.
We have the Medicare, yes, which is like 98 and something out of each one of our pays every month. And then we have this, a sub-plan where we're paying almost $800 a month. The basic on that one is the pharmaceutical industry. We pay more for our drugs than we do for our health care. Now, the main question is that I really want to ask is, why don't they investigate welfare? This is nothing but a fraudulent. These people live here year on year. They teach their children how to live on it. They're not supposed to have anything. But I turned against them when my son was hit by a car driven by a person on welfare in the crosswalk of school. He never even said he was sorry. He told my husband that my son hit his car, and he tore the emblem off. And I have been against the welfare system ever since then.
All right, Elaine. Peter Welch, any comment to what she had to say?
Well, a couple of things. One, federal employees didn't get a COLA. The pay's been frozen for federal employees. Number two, look, in any program, welfare or the Pentagon budget, there is abuse, and we should crack down on it whenever and wherever we can. And that's important to do. Whether it's being done adequately enough where you live, I don't know. But your point, if there's use, whether it's welfare, whether it's corporate loopholes, whether it's people not paying their taxes, we should enforce the laws we have, and people shouldn't be able to get away with that. I agree with that.
Peter Welch, a lot of comments over the months about Mitch McConnell's comment about ensuring that President Obama is a one-term president.
Right.
But from the flip side, isn't that Mitch McConnell's political job? Isn't he part of the Republican Party whose political job it is to ensure that President Obama is a one-term president? You
know, that's an unfortunate definition of your job if you have an office, whether you're Republican or Democrat. Yes, you have your team, and you want your team to win. But your job is to help make America successful. And just fighting against each other, it guarantees gridlock and impedes success. So no, you know, you can do both. You can be a spirited competitor, and when the election comes, you're for your side. You want your candidate to win. But in politics, you've got to work with people you disagree with, And you've got to respect, in my view, that the people you disagree with often have the same motivation to make America a better country that you have. And Republicans and Democrats have to have that mutual respect, just like you do. You know, in Vermont we have town meetings, and it's smaller. And what happens over time is you get to know people that you disagreed with, and you see that they have the same struggles. They worry about their kids. They might have a setback because they lose a job. They have a death in the family. Their motivations, their humanity is absolutely the same as yours, even if they disagree. And we need, I think, more of that, not just combat all the time.
And isn't it your job as Chief Deputy Whip to whip members against Republican proposals?
It's not so much against Republican proposals. It should be about for our positive ideas. And in fact, you know, I really work hard, even though I'm a Chief Deputy Whip, to find Republicans that I can work with. You know, Jason Chaffetz is a conservative member of Congress from Utah. He and I joined forces to do a letter on Afghanistan calling to end our nation-building strategy. And then I invited him to participate in a telephone town hall meeting I had with Vermonters. I worked with Joanne Emerson, a Missouri Republican, on trying to lower the cost of prescription drugs. I worked with Joe Barton from Texas, who really denies global warming is a problem, and we work together on an energy efficiency bill. So I find it much more satisfying to look for the areas where we share something, some common ground, and do it together. And sure, when it comes to the election, I'll be for the Democrats by and large, but working with Republicans is really, really important for me to have a chance of being successful.
Next call for Congressman Welch comes from Dothan, Alabama. Go ahead, Ashley, Democrat.
Yes, good morning. I was calling to see, like, how does the cut, cap, and balance affect Social Security for the mentally impaired, like the disabled people that can't work?
Thank you, Ashley.
If you're on Social Security disability, I think you would still be getting your Social Security disability benefits. You know, Social Security, as you know, is a separate program that's self-funded. So it really shouldn't be something that's used as a piggy bank to balance the budget where we have challenges because of the spending in the Pentagon and everywhere else, really. Social Security has to stand on its own, and any changes that are made in Social Security should be solely about making Social Security stronger, more sustainable.
Congressman Welch, when Congressman Goodlatte was out here earlier, he kept talking about, or he referred to the trajectory of spending is unsustainable. Do you agree with that? And if so, how would you change it?
Well, I do. Congressman Goodlatte is, I think, at a legitimate point about the trajectory of spending. Like, for instance, in health care, not just Medicare, but if you're going up in expenses 2 and 3 times the rate of inflation profits in wages, you can't sustain that. If you have Pentagon spending that's going up as fast as it is, you can't sustain that. If you're spending at the rate of about 24% of the gross domestic product, and you've let the tax base shrink to a historic low of about 15% of the gross domestic product, those lines are going in opposite directions. So in the concern about the trajectory of spending and the balance of revenues and spending, I think he's got a legitimate point. And Democrats, we agree with that. Now, our approach is different. You know, the cut, cap, and balance, I think, actually would handcuff us and do a lot of economic damage. On the other hand, if we have a balanced approach of bringing spending down gradually, trying to reform the health care delivery system so that we don't have the most expensive health care in the world, and we bring up revenues and make the tax system more fair, I think we can get to balance. Keep in mind, we had a balanced budget several years under President Clinton. Now, we had higher taxes under President Clinton, but with those higher taxes, we had a lower unemployment rate. We created 20 million jobs. In the Bush years, when we had lower taxes, we lost 700,000 jobs. So it's got to be balanced, and I think that's what the American people know.
Eddie Evans tweets into you, Congressman, is increasing new debt the only way to avoid default on our old debt? Doesn't seem right.
Well, it doesn't, and I understand that concern because a lot of people think that what we're doing is borrowing more money to spend more money. But in fact, when you're increasing the debt ceiling, what you're doing is authorizing us to continue paying obligations that are already incurred. You know, there's something on this debt ceiling debate, by the way, that's really not on the level. On the Republican side, you know, and I hate to make it sound so partisan, but here's the point. In the House, the Republicans voted for the Ryan budget, which would significantly cut spending over 10 years. It would significantly cut Medicare. But it also lowers taxes, particularly for the so-called job creators, as they're called by the Republicans, or other people would say the wealthy. But that budget increases the deficit from $14.3 trillion to $23 trillion in 10 years. So the folks who are now saying no to increasing the debt limit a few months ago said yes to a budget that is going to increase the debt by $10 trillion. So if you're for a budget that requires you to increase the debt ceiling, why aren't you doing that which you are requiring be done?
Next call for Congressman Welch. We have about 5 minutes left with our guest. Kissimmee, Florida. Hi, Jack, Republican.
How you doing? This is Jack Sherwood. I was a government employee for 40 years. We received COLA thanks to a Democrat that originally brought it in. We haven't had COLA since we've had a Democrat president. That's part one of the question. Part two of the question was the Democrats keep talking about taxation, in which we are a nation which only 50% of our nation pays taxes, and of that 50%, 40% of those taxes come out of the so-called rich. Now, where do they get off a fair tax for people who own 50% of the nation paying for it?
Congressman?
I'm not quite sure I totally understood that. Lower income people don't pay that much in taxes. That's true. They don't have much money. Higher income people pay more in taxes and they have more money. But the tax code, in my view, needs a lot of repair. You know, you've heard of Warren Buffett, who makes a fair amount of money, say that this provision in the tax code called carried interest allows him to pay a lower tax rate than people that work for him. I mean, he might pay 15 or 16%, whereas his accountant pays 36%. And Warren Buffett says that's not fair, it's not right, it doesn't make sense. So, you know, what's the right level of taxation? All of us can debate and argue, but the bottom line is we've had a history of progressive taxation. The rate goes up as you have the ability to pay more, and that has been significantly eroded over the years.
Matt is a Democrat calling from Gallia County, Ohio. Matt, where is Gallia County?
Gay County. It's at the southern part of Ohio.
Oh, toward Cincinnati side or the other side?
The other side.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, my comment is I'm 51 years old and I've been disabled, and I keep hearing they're going to cut Social Security and Medicare. I barely get by now, and they keep going on now how our debt is. But UK got us in this thing over in Libya, which is costing us $10 million a day. For what? We don't need to be there. Why are we there, wasting our money there when we're in debt?
Mr. Welch?
Well, you know, you have a really good point about priorities. You know, Medicare, Social Security, those things are absolutely important. You're 51, you said, and disabled, and you really depend on that. And it's not much. You know, you're scraping by. And if we spend money elsewhere, I mean, it's $10 million a day, but I'll tell you where we're spending a lot of money. It's Iraq and Afghanistan is where the big money is really going. Then it takes money away from being able to do other things. And that's the battle in Washington. It's about what should be our priorities. And in fact, I think we've got to do much more domestically. I think we have to be working hard to invest in our infrastructure, have a good healthcare system, and I think we ought to be moving away from these nation-building efforts that are extremely expensive and I don't think add to our national security.
What is the current status with Libya? It's kind of fallen out of the front pages and out of the papers in a sense. It's kind of in the back of our mind right now.
Well, that's right. What's the current status of Libya is that the United States is a partner in the coalition effort that is essentially focused on a bombing campaign that's intended to protect civilians in Libya from the wholesale slaughter that Muammar Gaddafi has promised if he were left to his own devices. I mean, Mr. Gaddafi obviously has lost international legitimacy. The United States and several other countries have recognized the transitional government as the valid authority. So the United States' role is limited as a partner in this bombing campaign intended to protect civilians. But the President has made it clear, no boots on the ground, and we're not arming the rebels.
Does Congress in general feel that it has enough of a say in what's going on in Libya right now?
No. I think the President should have complied with the War Powers Act and come to Congress for specific authorization. He disagrees with that. I support the War Powers Act.
Would you have supported it in this case?
I would have supported the policy in Libya. I do support. It's limited. As long as it's limited and it's intended to protect civilians from a slaughter, I do support that. But I do think the President should. I think the War Powers Act does apply here, and the President should come and seek specific permission.
Last call for Chief Deputy Whip Peter Welch comes from Milledgeville, Georgia. Hi, Leah.
Good morning, gentlemen. How are you?
Good.
Honored to speak with you this morning, Representative Welch. I've been very discouraged by the discussion and the way the debate is framed concerning these debt talks, considering the fact that, as you mentioned earlier, we've been at war for 10 years and have raised not $1 of revenue to pay for those activities. So when Republicans get on my television, I'm screaming at the screen trying to say, well, when are we going to pay for the wars? If we're never going to raise revenue, how are we ever going to deal with the deficit? And it seems to me that the whole point in their stance is to force the dismantling of the social contract. If the government doesn't have money to pay for Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid or, any other services that are needed, then they feel like they can force the dismantling of those programs. And it's very discouraging to see that some of the same people who voted for the prescription drug benefit or to go to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, to put those debt on the books, those debts on the books are now refusing to raise the debt ceiling to cover those debts.
Right.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, Leah. Thank you.
Well, that's pretty articulate. I couldn't say it better myself. That was very, very good, and I agree with you.
Peter Welch, Chief Deputy Whip, Democrat of Vermont. Thank you for being on the Washington Journal.
Thank you, Peter.
We've got about 45 minutes left in our show, and we're going to return to the phone hacking scandal in the UK with Alex Spilius, who is the Washington correspondent for the Daily Telegraph, newspaper, which is the largest circulating daily newspaper